Hello, everybody. I hope y'all are doing great today. As I'm recording this, it's a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I'm trying to get this recorded so I can get it uploaded so it'll be ready for you on Thursday. So this week we're going to start looking at the Aeneid, which will be our next epic hero's journey that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start with these couple of videos just giving you a little bit of background about this myth. It is a founding myth, and that's probably a term that you'll need to be familiar with. So when we say a work is a founding myth, what are we talking about? It's a work that explains how or why a civilization came to be. In this case, this story is considered one of two founding myths of the Roman Empire. Now, the other, if you look at that episode of Myths and Monsters that I'm going to post in this module, it's going to talk a little bit about the myth of the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, and that is actually the original founding myth of Rome. It held sway for many centuries until it was sort of supplanted by the Aeneid. And the reason for that is kind of a long, complicated history. But it really came down to Augustus Caesar deciding that the myth of Romulus and Remus was not a fit founding myth for the Roman Empire, or at least the Roman Empire that he envisioned. And the reason for that really comes down to, it's a story founded on the idea of fratricide, of brother killing brother. It has some parallels with the biblical Cain and Abel story. But, the way Augustus Caesar looked at that is that it essentially came down to, here is a story about one brother who is weak enough to kill his own brother, and the other who is weak enough to let himself be killed by his brother. And according to his view, neither was an exemplary leader for the Roman Empire. They were not good role models. So hence, he hires the poet Virgil to construct a new founding myth for Rome. Now, I'm going to start with, there's some things that this story has in common with the Iliad, Homer's great epic, which we have not talked about, unfortunately, because we don't have time to get into all the stories. But something that these two stories share is that they're both grounded in the conflict of the Trojan War. So hence that brings us to our first slide, where I say here, that did get a little bit cut off there, but it should say, Rome arises from the destruction of Troy. And this comes about because of one Trojan soldier, Aeneas, who survives the Trojan War with Greece and also survives a horrific shipwreck and makes a long journey to find a new home. We know this new home will eventually be the city of Rome, or the Roman Empire, rather. We're not going to cover the entire epic of the Aeneid. It would take far too long in a course like this. Books 1 and 2, we're mostly going to skim over. We're going to be mostly concerned with book 4. And book 4 is the tragic love story between Aeneas and Queen Dido of Carthage. But we still have to kind of talk about what happens in books 1 and 2 so that we understand what gets us to book 4. And so one of the things we learn in book 2, which is when Aeneas flashes back to the fall of Troy and what happened there. This is essentially what sends him on his call to adventure. This is what sets up the mission. So it starts with Aeneas as a soldier at the time that the Trojan horse is let into the gates of Troy. And Aeneas is a soldier whose post is to defend the city. Well, in very graphic detail, the story tells us that they do let the Trojan horse into the gate. The Greek soldiers come out. They ransack the city. They burn down the king's castle. They behead the king. They set the entire city on fire. So everybody's, it's just mass chaos. It's burning and looting and destruction. And the soldiers are killing everybody in sight. So Aeneas decides, he has a choice. He can either continue to hold his post and defend a city that at this point can no longer be defended, or he can escape and run home to save his family. So, being a human being, as so often is the case, our first priority in times of disaster is going to be our families. So he abandons his post and runs home to try to save his family. That's what this illustration depicts. It's a very famous painting from the Aeneid that shows Aeneas escaping the burning city with his family. He's carrying his father across his shoulder because the story goes that his father refused to leave. He said, "Oh, they can burn the house over my head. I will not leave." And so, in a last-ditch attempt to save his father, who refuses to leave, Aeneas just slings the old man up like a sack of potatoes, throws him over his shoulder, and flees through the burning city with his father over his shoulder. And he's also trying to hold on to his wife and his young son, trying to make sure that they don't get separated. So the story tells us that they form a chain. And I mean, we do that a lot of times now. Like if you're in a really crowded place, like a crowded concert or nightclub, you might try to hold on to your friend's hand so that you don't lose each other in the crowd. This is what he's trying to do, but at some point, his wife gets swallowed up in the melee. He loses contact with her. He looks back, and the last thing he sees of his wife is that she gets swallowed up in the mob. He can't find her. At some point, he just has to give her up for dead. He doesn't know for sure what's happened to her, but he can't save her. So, and again, he's burdened with, he's trying to hang on to his father. He's got his son to think about. Eventually, he gets separated from his son as well and has to give up his son for dead and leave him behind. Now, years and years and years later, he actually does find his son. He learns that his son did survive, but that's not until many, many years later. So at this point in the story, he's basically lost his family. I'm not real sure what happens with his father. He does manage to get his father out of the burning city, but then at some point, the father is presumed dead as well. So he kind of just ends up with this ragtag group of soldiers who kind of band around him, and he basically sets off on this mission to find a new home. The old home Troy has been destroyed, the family's gone, and his mission becomes the mission that's appointed to him from the gods is to find a new home, a new sanctuary. So of course, again, it's a founding myth of Rome, and it's a story intended to explain how this lowly soldier who's lost everything manages to found the Roman Empire. Right, so the Roman Empire, it's considered one of the great nations of the ancient world, But here's a point I want to make. Just no great civilization or nation is built without sacrifice. No great nation exists without blood on its hands. The Roman Empire achieved what they achieved through force and often violent and very bloody means. And what's a little bit scary about that, y'all, is that the Roman Empire and their system of democracy was really what the American founding fathers modeled for the United States of America. And I want you to let that sink in for a minute and look at these two images here. Now, I do apologize. I know they're graphic, but I'm showing you these for a reason. Because what has our nation been built on? You know, and it's scary when we think the nation most often compared to ancient Rome is the USA. We know that the USA is still a relatively young country. You know, we're only, I can't think of the exact number off the top of my head, but we're still under 300 years old. We're roughly about 250 as a country. I think roughly about 250 years old. The Roman Empire lasted over 500 years before it fell, but it eventually fell from its own corruption within. And again, you know, going back to what I said, no great nation exists without blood on its hands. The Romans built their empire on violence and conquering and oppressing. The United States, this nation was built on the back of displaced Native Americans. You know, this is the image from the Wounded Knee Massacre. 300 Native American men, women, and children massacred by the U.S. government for practicing a spiritual ceremony. We know that Jim Crow, slavery, lynchings, I mean, these are all part of United States history. So when we think about the U.S. being modeled on the Roman Empire, again, I'm just going to leave it at that. That's something to think about, okay? Because were they a great nation as far as what they accomplished and their political accomplishments, scientific accomplishments, medical accomplishments, engineering accomplishments? You know, absolutely. But at what cost? And again, I think in this country, you know, we have to look at our own example. All right, so on that cheerful thought, I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to pick up in the second video, and we're going to continue with looking at this history of the Ennead.